A gentleman yield back. We will go next to the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Harshbarger. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today to come to testify. You know, this is just my opinion, but I think taking AM radios out of a car is a bad decision by automakers. Most of the people in my district put gas in their cars or gas or diesel in their trucks, and they don't drive EVs. And a lot of them have computers that they don't get on very often, and they don't have smartphones. And Mr. Smith, you know, my question to you is, are manufacturers considering cutting AM and gas-powered vehicles? And I say that because I heard something that Mr. Chapman said earlier. He alluded to that.
Well, as I've mentioned, we are committed for a full range and plethora of options for getting these systems. And individual company decisions on specific technologies is not something I really can comment on.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Chapman, you said in your statement earlier, most PEP stations are AM radio stations because their signals can cover vast areas, some with a 700-mile coverage radius and travel better through solid objects like mountains. I represent East Tennessee. All we have is mountains. We have the Great Smoky Mountains. And, you know, FEMA has invested millions in these stations, and they're battle-hardened and to withstand various national disasters, of, you say, and terrorism, so we're able to communicate critical information. You also say that wireless emergency alerts are not as reliable in these situations as cell towers can be damaged, and networks are overwhelmed by high call volume. And Lieutenant Colonel, you talked about some of the forest fires, severe weather events and forest fires. And, you know, I represent Great Smoky Mountains, Sevier County, and we had a wildfire last year that destroyed numerous homes. And we had a huge, one of the worst disasters in Tennessee in 2016 with the fires in Gatlinburg, and we lost a lot of lives. And there were communication problems. They were overwhelmed. The radio systems were overwhelmed. And that's why I feel like we absolutely need to keep the AM radio service as, you know, an emergency system. And, you know, I guess we're paying consumers to buy EVs, which is indirectly a subsidy to automakers. And you can tell me if you agree with this, but maybe we should think about removing that tax credit for EVs if they don't have an AM radio system. But it is an important, incredibly important thing to keep these avenues open for things like that. Lieutenant Colonel, do you have anything to add about the emergency broadcast systems and how important they are?
Thank you for the opportunity, Congresswoman. I agree. We have some rural areas in New Jersey, surprisingly, as much as we might look like a very suburban urban state. And the reach of the cellular networks in some of those areas, particularly an area where we just had a forest fire this past week, was very limited.
Yeah.
And the communication means with those individuals, if they had to evacuate, would almost primarily been through the AM radio band to communicate with those partners.
Yeah, that's the issue. And I have two distressed counties where, when I said that earlier, it wasn't to say that we're not a sophisticated district. It's to say that a lot of people don't have those smartphones. A lot of people don't use or access computers because we have the lack of broadband. So my opinion, it's critically important to keep AM service going. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. We'll go next to the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Lieutenant Colonel DeMace. In terms of emergency broadcasting, it's my understanding that you're Deputy State Director of Emergency Management, and you've also had roles in the State Emergency Response Commission. Would you just share for a moment about the footprint of AM versus other emergency broadcasting channels? What percentage of emergency broadcasting would you say goes currently through AM channels?
That's a technical question. I don't necessarily have the exact scope and answer to. I'm kind of understanding your meaning.
Could you just speak to the level of dependence that our emergency systems have on AM versus other
Yes,
other options?
In our rural areas, certainly that percentage of dependence will be much higher. than the cellular networks. In that there's areas, believe it or not, in New Jersey where there's no cellular connectivity whatsoever. In many cases, we're seeing a transition throughout our society where people are not securing landlines as much anymore and relying on cellular networks for their communications means. So to the point of when we have that crisis and that emergency happens and that person is either at their residence or maybe in transition through an area with very limited cellular connectivity, the AM radio band would be one of the primary means for us to communicate.
Okay, so it is significant. It's a significant vehicle for communications of emergency.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Schmidt, there's been a couple questions that's come your way in this regard, and I don't know that I really got a good understanding of your comments on it. Maybe that's on purpose, maybe it's not. But how is it that not all auto manufacturers are having the same issues with interference when it comes to emergency vehicles?
Well, interference, my understanding of interference is dependent on vehicle architecture, and different, even within various EVs, those architectures change. Motors can be in different places, the electronic devices can be different places, the receiver can be at different places. In space, EMF drops off rapidly with space. So what may be an issue with one manufacturer versus another, and the remediation from one to the other will be somewhat different. And I really can't comment since I'm not aware of specific architectures, but I think there are differences in how vehicle manufacturers or vehicles are constructed and the kind of levels of EMF and the levels of shielding needed, and also maybe within the software used to filter the signals to clean them up. And
So let me ask you this, because I'm having a hard time just on the technical front, having just a little bit of technical background with the response from some that this is a technical issue, that it's just an interference that just can't be overcome, or it's just too cumbersome. We've heard things about the shielding, the expense, the weight. Do you buy into to that? Do you, or you're a safety person? Is there a safety implication to this?
And from a safety standpoint, I think it's very critical, and that's where our commitment comes from, is that we're looking at all avenues of the iPOS to provide alerts. Our members are committed to doing that, and we have provided many, many ways of getting information out through our vehicles now. So that's our.
So in terms of implementing an AM option, you're not aware of safety concerns in terms of the actual implement in the vehicle?
No.
Mr. Chapman, would you care to address any of that? I mean, again, just to reframe my comment, I'm struggling with just this idea that, oh, wait, we have technical obstacles. We can't get this put in place. But yet some suppliers, some manufacturers seem to be able to get this handled, and some do not. Can you comment on that?
Congressman, I think that's a fair question. I'm a broadcaster. There's some automakers that have chosen to figure it out, and other automakers have not. So other than that, I don't know how to answer it. You did ask a moment ago about number of radio stations. There's roughly 15,000 commercial radio stations across the country. 4,500 of those are AM radio stations. To put it into perspective, the emergency alert system.
And thank you for that. I'll wrap up my comments with this, but I think you said a key word in your answer. You said they have chosen to work this out, and I think that's exactly right. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go next to my colleague from Ohio. Congressman Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to wave on to today's hearing. AM radio reception is an important communications asset for rural Appalachian areas, including much of my district in eastern Ohio. Personally, I appear frequently on AM radio shows as a way to communicate with constituents in my district. But more importantly, it's a necessary and critical public safety asset, especially for remote areas where broadband and even cellular service are not always available. I'm pleased that my legislation, H.R. 1353, the Alert Parity Act, recently passed the House of Representatives as it calls for the establishing of rules through which providers of emergency connectivity service can provide access to 911 and emergency alerts in unserved areas. It's unfathomable for many to understand that there remains in America remote areas that still lack reliable cellular service. And removing AM radio receivers from vehicles in rural America would only compound the issue by cutting off access to the backbone of our nation's emergency communications infrastructure in areas that have truly limited communication options already. Thank you, Chairman Latta, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for providing your valuable insight on this issue today. Mr. Schmidt, you stated in your testimony that the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, or IPAWS, was designed to provide redundant alert mechanisms to ensure the public has access to multiple outlets to receive emergency alerts. As I just mentioned, there are remote areas in my district that lack cellular and broadband service. If AM radio receivers are removed from vehicles, can you please discuss the options people who live or travel in these remote areas will have for receiving emergency alerts and public safety information?
Thank you for that question. And yes, as you mentioned we are committed for looking at going through the whole range of the IPAWS subs because that is a safety network as well. And there are things such as satellite that do have very strong coverage across the nation as well. So each part of that network has pros and cons, and I think that's why FEMA is looking to try to diversify it and even modernize it, because I think our view is we're technology forward and we're trying to look at how to address some of the issues that FEMA has already identified with AM and how to move it forward for the future.
Well, let me expand on that question. Let me ask it a different way. So no cellular, no broadband. Seems to me like in many areas of the country, and if we take AM out, the only available communication that many people will have in rural areas is satellite, correct?
Yep.
Okay, all right. Well, Mr. Chapman, as you know, broadcasters stepped up during the COVID pandemic to continue providing local communities with fact-based journalism, breaking news, and support for local businesses. What was the role of AM radio in this type of coverage?
Congressman, thank you for the question. One of the things that we did early on, we did fundraisers for local businesses. This is as small town as it gets. We opened up the mics and we started selling business cards for those businesses, and that money all went to those local businesses. That's one way that radio steps up. Another way is the increased investment that we've made in our news operation. Towns like Anderson, Indiana, have been through a lot. They need somebody to help them understand complex issues. When we up our news department on WHBU, it means that we're having more people to deal with those issues, to have it on the radio so the community can have a better understanding.
Okay.
It's the same thing we've done with reprogramming one of our stations. It's to help the community understand.
Okay. In your view, then, are there benefits of AM radio for rural communities that cannot be provided through other means?
Absolutely. We have those two examples I just shared with you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back an entire 21 seconds.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Looks like I'm batting cleanup, so I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank you for your testimony today. You've done a really good job of illustrating why AM radio is so important, Mr. Chapman. I found your testimony about the incident with your family and the train derailment to be very poignant. But I want to echo the comments of several of my colleagues, most recently Congressman Pfluger, in saying that normally I'm not a big fan of government mandates. I think that consumers are generally very intelligent about deciding what they're willing to pay for and why, as long as it's explained to them. So the question that we're debating today is whether or not the Department of Transportation should be empowered to mandate that an AM radio be part of every new car sold. So I want to direct a couple of my questions to getting to the heart of that. Mr. Schmidt, do you know about how much a inclusion of an AM radio adds to the cost of a car?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned, I think before you came in, that's information that I don't have a firm grasp on. That's individual for each manufacturer and their individual systems and what kind of remediation levels they need to provide on it.
Okay, so, I mean, I think it's fair to say it's probably not $1. It's probably, I don't know, in the $100 range, something like that. Does that sound fair?
I really don't know because I don't.
I'm just guessing because I know it's more than just the equipment. There's an antenna, and AM radio antennas have to be quite long and installed in the car. So, I mean, let's just say it's in that range of that figure. And without arguing one side or another, how would you articulate the argument to a consumer who says, look, that's $100 of my money. I don't want an AM radio. I've got other means of getting emergency information. So, why are you forcing me, Department of Transportation, to pay $100 or more for this equipment that I don't want?
Was that addressed to me? I'm
Sure.
sorry.
Well, no, I mean, it's a hypothetical conversation with a consumer who's saying, to you, I don't want to be forced to pay $100 for equipment that I don't want and won't use.
Yeah, I think our position is that we think mandates are a blunt instrument, and especially for a technology that, as FEMA has said, has some declining listenership. And so I think, I think it's important for the consumers to understand and make those decisions.
Okay, fair enough. Lieutenant Colonel DeMays, I really enjoyed your testimony, and one of the things that stuck with me is the statistic that you cited that a third of AM radio listeners are 60 years of age or older. And I think that sounds about right. In fact, it might be, in my experience, might be a little low. One concern that I have, though, is that in modern cars, the AM radio system is buried so far in the user interface, I question whether or not consumers can even find it. So if I put my mother in my car that is it's all touch screen and it's, and ask her to tune in on an AM radio station, I'm not sure she could do it. What do you think about that?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a very interesting point. And I think it goes down to the preparedness component of emergency management. We want people to exercise their plan, so to speak. And whatever that plan might be in the crisis, make sure that they know what works. The time to sort out where those things are isn't in the middle of the storm. It's prior to. While there may take some education and outreach associated with achieving that goal, it's a worthwhile endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Right, I completely agree with you. Mr. Chapman, your testimony was very moving to me about the experience that you had with the train derailment. You mentioned that getting the information that you got over the AM radio, that was the only solution at the time because cell phones at the time were not capable of delivering that information, but now they are. So, and they do it in a way that is fundamentally different from radio, which is, a one-directional stream of information, whereas the cell phone, you could say, hey, what just happened? What does that glow? And it can answer you. So why as technology changes, as the way cars are equipped is changing, why should our method of delivery for this emergency information not change with it?
Congressman, thank you. I think it's a fair question. We've evolved the FEMA mechanisms from Conrail early on 50 years ago to our current form of alerts. It is important that we recognize how to evolve things, but at the same time, we can't stop and make a hard no and say that we're no longer going to access a significant portion of the population, which this would do right now. It's important to look at innovation, but we don't have a ready fix to do at this point in time with the removal of AM from the EAS system.
Right. Well, I want to thank you very much for everyone for their testimony. We have no questioners left here in the room, so I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. And seeing no further members to be recognized, thank you very much for your testimony and for your willingness to be here today to educate all of us on this important issue. There being no further business before the subcommittee, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record. I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly, and I know you will. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on Tuesday, June the 20th. Without objection, the subcommittee is now adjourned.